Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the OBS Pod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter anyone else that's interested, the OBS Pod is for you. Episode 157, Monitoring the Fetus in Labour. I am overjoyed today to welcome Dr. Kirsten Small, her of Birth Small Talk, to the OBS Pod. And I'm hoping this is going to be an incredible episode. A few listeners have actually asked if the two of us could get together. And thankfully, despite being the other side of the world, she readily accepted my invitation to come on the OBS Pod and discuss things CTG. So without further ado, Kirsten, welcome. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And we obstetricians that are attempting to do education in the online space for people should definitely be backing one another up. I've been interested in the question of why there's a difference between what the evidence says about approaches to monitoring the fetal heart rate in labour and what actually happens since I was a trainee. And I had the space in my life back in 2018 to start a PhD. So it seemed time to actually take a seriously proper deep dive and look at the evidence and find a research question that needed answering and focus on creating some new knowledge that would hopefully help shift us in the right direction in maternity service provision when it comes to the issue of fetal heart rate monitoring, because it is an area that's been considerably controversial over the decades, and there's certainly room for improvement.
Thank you. So I came across you on Twitter and blogs and things, and it kind of pricked my interest because rather than teaching, this is how we interpret CTGs, it was very much more, why are we doing them? What's the evidence for doing them? And I dipped into your taster course. So you run a course for professionals, and I dipped into a taster course that you run last week. And you started off with a very important thing of what should we call it? And I must admit, just even that was really interesting to me, because I've thought a lot about the language we use in the birth space, and language that we use that is difficult in terms of labelling women, like failure and sort of judgmental language. But I hadn't thought about the fact that electronic fetal heartbeat monitoring might be inappropriate language. And you very much got us back to focusing on CTG, cardiotocograph. Would you like to briefly explain why that is?
Yeah, so CTG, cardiotocograph, it does what it says on the tin. Cardio, heart rate monitoring, toco, uterine contractions, and it produces a graph showing how they change in relation to one another. So it's, it is exactly what it says it is. And then you can add some kind of descriptor at the end of it. So you can talk about CTG use or CTG recording or tracing or monitoring or whatever. Electronic fetal monitoring, or EFM, is the abbreviation that's often used to mean exactly the same thing. And it came into use really early in the history of CTG monitoring. But I spent a lot of time thinking about it when I was writing the 25 bazillion drafts of the PhD, thinking about what words are the best words to use. And it didn't sit well with me increasingly over time, because the other alternative is to listen to the fetal heart rate intermittently. And while once upon a time that would have been done with a device like a Pinard stethoscope, which was not electronic in any way, in current practice in most parts of the world, we use an electronic handheld Doppler device to listen to the fetal heart rate, which is a form of fetal monitoring. So intermittent auscultation is a form of electronic fetal monitoring, which then clouds the issue as to, well, when you say electronic fetal monitoring, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about using a CTG, or are we talking about using a handheld Doppler to intermittently auscultate the fetal heart rate? And it itself doesn't really tell you what's going on. The other reason I decided not to go with it is the problem that happens when CTG monitoring becomes fetal monitoring is that then if you're not doing CTG monitoring, it's very easy to say, we are not doing fetal monitoring. When in fact, if you're doing intermittent auscultation, you are doing fetal monitoring. And the evidence, which we'll probably get into in a moment, says that mostly it's actually equivalent in terms of, the outcomes that you can expect for the baby with CTG monitoring. So to try and keep the two separate, I always talk about CTG monitoring and intermittent auscultation. And I think electronic fetal monitoring just kind of clouds the issue and makes it complicated for people. Having said that, it is a personal choice, and I don't criticise other people. And, so long as we can be clear about what it is that we're doing. But I do think it creates a sense of moral panic when you say, well, I'm not going to use electronic fetal monitoring. People often assume that means that you are not going to do anything at all in the way of paying attention to the well-being of the fetus, and that worries people, which is, it certainly is not what I'm proposing people do.
Yeah, I very much, it really went into my head, the idea that monitoring is actually us looking at the thing, not the thing itself. That definitely had a big impact on me.
Certainly you can produce a magnificent CTG recording, and unless somebody's looking at it, no monitoring is actually happening. And I've certainly heard stories, and I heard it as well when I was doing my PhD, of cases where a CTG machine had been attached to a woman. She'd been left alone. Nobody had come back. And when somebody finally returned to the room, the baby had died.
That's just horrific.
So it might be electronic fetal monitoring, but there's actually no monitoring that's happening because no one's looking at it. So you can't assume that just popping a monitor on is actually going to solve the problem. It's about the people that are doing the process.
Yeah. I also liked the fact you talked about that CTG includes the woman because of the tachograph. And it's interesting because I had, with women in mind, switched to calling it fetal monitoring because I thought that was more intelligible and understandable to a lay person than CTG, which you have to go, oh, it's a cardiotachograph and that means this and that means you have to explain it all. But I hadn't thought about the fact that was removing the woman. And that challenged my assumptions, definitely. So in a good way. So I'm now going to have to go back and go back to CTG, which is how I was brought up in the first place anyway. But think about how to make that intelligible to people. So then we get to the kind of nitty gritty of, well, why are we doing this? Because we use CTGs all the time. So I'm pleased to say we don't do admission CTGs anymore, which was a thing that was present at the beginning of my career, where you did 20 minutes when any woman walked through the door. So we don't do that. But anyone deemed, in inverted commas, high risk is recommended to have continuous CTG in labour. And I don't know about Australia, but in the UK, the number of women now deemed high risk seems to be increasing exponentially, because we've got women who are deemed to have gestational diabetes. Don't get me started on that. Women who are older, over 40, women who actually might have a problem like growth restriction, any woman having an induction, which the induction rates are very high. We mentioned before we started recording meconium. So the number of women that we're then default strapping onto our monitors is high, and that has a massive impact on their labour. But instead of examining what are we doing strapping people onto monitors, we're making wireless monitors, which is good. That's beneficial. That's very helpful. But that's not looking at why we're using the monitors in the first place. And on your mini course, you had a really nice kind of comparison of data. So perhaps you could just once and for all say what you think in terms of the data shows us.
Yeah. So the best evidence comes from randomized controlled trials, where they select a group of women and then randomly assign them either to have CTG monitoring or intermittent auscultation. So you should end up with the same kind of factors going on in the background for both groups of women that might potentially explain a difference in outcomes. It should be the same. And then, you do the monitoring and they have their babies, and you come back and you measure the outcomes to see what went on. So there's been 11 trials where the comparison has been CTG monitoring versus intermittent auscultation, and one other where the comparison was between having lots of CTG machines available, so almost everyone had CTG monitoring, versus locking most of the CTG machines away in a cupboard every second month so that only a handful of people can have them. And it gets mixed in with the other ones, even though strictly speaking, it's a slightly different approach. And the outcomes that interest me most are the long-term outcomes. While it matters whether a baby has a low APGAR score or not, if a baby has a low APGAR score and is then completely fine, it's not that important. So the biggest ticket item is obviously death. So there's two parts of that. There's the baby being alive at the start of labour, but then dying at some stage during the labour so that it's stillborn. Or there's death in the first week of life related to low oxygen levels that have occurred during labour. And then when you combine, so that's an early neonatal death. And if you combine the two, we call it perinatal mortality. Using CTG monitoring during labour compared to intermittent auscultation makes no difference to the stillbirth rate. It makes no difference to the early neonatal death rate. And when you add the two together and call it perinatal mortality, again, there's no difference in terms of outcomes. So, if anyone's attempted to say something like you have to have this because it'll stop your baby from dying, or CTG monitoring saves lives, there's no evidence to back that up at all. The next important long-term outcome is cerebral palsy. So that's damage to the developing brain of the fetus during labour due to low oxygen levels that results in a permanent brain injury that turns up with things like movement disorders and sometimes intellectual impairment as well. That's lifelong and can't be fixed. And there's not an awful lot of research. Only 2 research groups did long-term follow-up to see what happened, so again, randomized people, and as well as collecting data, in the few days after the baby was born, they followed them up for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years to see what happened. No difference in cerebral palsy rates. Except when you get to the fine print, out of those two, one of the studies was done in an exclusively high-risk population, and the specific risk factor was that all of the women were in preterm labour. So they were under 30, between 26 and 32 weeks pregnant when they went into labour. And the cerebral palsy rate was 2.5 times higher when CTGs had been used, which...
Wow.
The research was done in the 1980s, and no one's kind of gone, well, that's interesting. We should really go back and verify that and do it in some other populations and see what's going on here. But there's kind of been a collective sticking the fingers in the ears and saying, la, 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 we'll just pretend it didn't happen, because no one has ever gone back and said, well, that's really interesting. We should ask some more questions here. So, you know, there's the beginnings of a suggestion that CTG monitoring might actually be harmful in some groups of women and babies. And we've never really got to the bottom of that to know who is best served by CTG monitoring and who isn't. The one area where CTGs seem to come out on top is with neonatal seizures that happen in a day or two or up to a week after the birth of the baby. And if you mix low risk, high risk, everybody in together into the maximum number of people that have ever been in a research trial, then there's a statistically significant difference. And the rate of neonatal seizures falls from 30 for every 10,000 births to 15 for every 10,000 births when intermittent auscultation is used. So higher with intermittent auscultation, lower with CTG monitoring, and the difference is a difference of 15, 10,000. So that does mean that you need to do an awful lot of CTG monitoring to prevent one baby from having a neonatal seizure. And the trials where they did that, two of those were the long-term trials where they then followed those babies through. And despite the fact that the seizures were happening more often, it made no difference to long-term outcomes. So yes, right. Jolly awful thing to have your baby have fits right after birth, but they're probably going to turn into a completely delightful 3-year-old who's going to be able to climb trees and run around parks just like all the other 3-year-olds. So, for the really impactful long-term outcomes, CTG monitoring seems to offer us no advantages over intermittent auscultation.
Yeah, I'm just going to let that sit there for a moment, because that's mega. And I kind of know that in the way I practice, and I talk to women about that because I'm fortunate that I see quite a lot of women that question what we're doing and ask for more personalised sort of bespoke planning. But I still have to say to them, well, this is the guidance, but actually the evidence is debatable. But the fact that the evidence is there that it doesn't benefit, that's stronger than the evidence is a bit mixed, or, we're recommending stuff in our national guidance, which the evidence isn't great for. The evidence is great. It just it doesn't back us up. Why do you think that's so hard for people to grasp, sort of professionally?
I think midwives and obstetricians, like we want to make things better for people, and stillbirth in particular. I mean, it's a shockingly awful thing to happen. And so if there's any glimmer of a suggestion, of a whisper of a possibility that we might be able to improve that when it's an uncommon outcome, so reasonably healthy woman, one baby, close to her due date, the chance of intrapartum stillbirth is about 3 in 10,000. So, it's really uncommon. So again, you need to have a supremely impactful intervention if you're going to reduce that to 1. You need to have something that's a really, really powerful tool, and CTG monitoring just isn't that. But because those poor outcomes happen so infrequently, and because CTG use is so common, it becomes really easy to start believing that Well, the outcomes for the other 99,997 babies were great. And so it must be working, because every time I put a CTG on, the baby's alive. So woohoo, the technology must work. And it's certainly, I think it's the same in the UK. It's certainly my experience here in Australia, is that if you go to a fetal monitoring course that's designed to teach you, mostly they teach you about CTGs. Occasionally they'll talk about intermittent auscultation instead, or as well as. It's almost always about the wiggly lines. It's about what the fetal heart rate patterns mean. And it's often also about who you should be advising CTG monitoring for, memorizing the big long lists that get increasingly long each year of all of these women that now are considered to have an indication for CTG monitoring. I've never, apart from the courses that I run, have ever seen a course that sits people down and goes through, there's a really important question that we need to ask first, and that is, should we be doing this, before we move on to the for whom and how question.
Yeah.
And because we're not educating maternity professionals about the evidence, they kind of pick up that, well, if the technology exists and the guideline says so, then that must be because there's evidence behind it, because that's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
And so then, Kirsten comes along, turns up and says these things that are considered really controversial when they shouldn't be, because it's just what the evidence says.
Yes.
And it really creates some discomfort for people to be put in a place where they have to recognise that there's this big gap between what they're told is the best approach to saving babies' lives and what the research is actually telling us.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I have to attend an annual CTG update and competency, and the focus is on, can I interpret the CTG? Although we do physiological CTG interpretation, which I don't know if there's no evidence for that either, but I do think I can understand the logic of trying to understand how the baby is actually physiologically coping with the situation it's in. So it makes slightly more sense than pattern recognition type interpretation. But
so I'd argue that that's just good branding.
Yeah,
because all CTG interpretation is based on an understanding, or a misunderstanding more accurately, of how fetal physiology works. So every single guideline is based in fetal physiology.
Yeah.
And even in the physiology CTG interpretation guideline, you still have to be able to recognise a pattern. Like, what does a baseline look like? It's still a pattern.
Yeah. No,
it's just that people are told that they're no longer looking for patterns.
Yeah.
So I think it's just good branding.
Yeah.
I await some evidence to see how their guideline matches up in terms of outcomes. There's a tiny little bit of research that's looked at that particular guideline compared with several others in terms of, the ability of a tracing that's been categorised as normal to tell you that the baby actually is okay, and the ability of a tracing that's been categorised as not normal to tell you that the baby is not okay. And it does perform reasonably well in comparison to some other guidelines in that respect. That's not the same as saying that using it produces better outcomes for the baby, though.
Yeah, what I was about to say is we need a new randomized controlled trial with physiology-based interpretation to see if it makes a difference to outcomes. And
we do.
My unit introducing it did seem to make a difference to outcomes, but we had a lot of intensive teaching. We had a fetal monitoring specialist midwife. We had 2 consultants spending a lot of time. So there's all sorts of confounding things that maybe cause the improvement in outcomes. And of course, we're going to say, well, brilliant, we've had an improvement in outcomes, and that's fantastic. like you said, if we can save any single family from that desperately awful situation of their baby dying or being damaged, but cause and effect is not necessarily true if we just take that. So one for the future. I look forward to a randomized controlled trial and then your analysis of it. Which brings us a little bit to how, so knowing that a lot of the audience that listen to my podcast are midwives or student midwives, if we've just blown their minds by saying there's no evidence that it has a difference in terms of outcomes, CTG, how they're supposed to get up and go to work tomorrow and work in the confines of a system that has this belief, and I'm going to call it a belief because that is what it is, isn't it? Essentially, it's a belief that CTGs make a difference. That's quite difficult for them to get their heads round. Do you have any advice for sort of how they might kind of reconcile these two things in their heads?
It's certainly something that I've struggled with when I had the two hats of being both a clinically practicing obstetrician and being a researcher. And I would have conversations inside my own head, as I was saying, well, you better put the CTG on with, researcher Kirsten saying, that doesn't work. You've probably signed some kind of an employment contract that says you'll abide with the policies and guidelines of your institution. So, if you would like to continue being employed, then you need to abide by the guidelines of your institution. What needs to happen is change at a fundamentally different level, though. I really don't want to see midwives and obstetricians turning up with hammers and attacking CTG machines and tossing them off the backs of cliffs and being quite destructive and radical in the process. I think that the two things that really annoy me most about the current state that we found ourselves in with CTG monitoring are, firstly, that we're not honest with women in our counselling. And so that needs to change. We need to have honest conversations with women about the fact that we have these two options. The evidence would suggest that in terms of outcomes for the baby, they're equivalent. In terms of the evidence for the outcomes for you, you're more likely to have a caesarean section or an instrumental birth, forceps or vacuum assisted birth, if you choose to have CTG monitoring. Whether you are considered to be at low risk or considered to be at high risk, that's the same. So it's not that there's a whole body of evidence out there about women who've got risk factors that says, no, CTGs actually work for those women. That doesn't exist at all. So, even in situations where, for example, a woman's had a previous caesarean section and now plans to labour, she has a twin pregnancy, she's in preterm labour, she's being induced. In all of those situations, intermittent auscultation remains an evidence-based valid choice. It may well make care providers jolly uncomfortable. There's been some good research looking at whether we actually enable women to have a choice, a decision about which approach to fetal heart rate monitoring they're going to use. And in most of the studies, the number of women who said that they actively made a decision about, yes, I want a CTG or yes, I want intermittent auscultation was less than 10%. So what happens mostly in practice is things like a midwife saying, oh, I'm just going to pop you on the monitor now. Or because of X, you have to have. And so the idea that there's a decision to be made doesn't even enter the conversation, let alone a discussion about the evidence base. Here's the benefits, here's the risks, here's the potential consequences of this choice. This is what might change my advice at a later point in time, and we might revisit it if that happens. Those conversations aren't happening.
Yes.
And I'd really like to see us having those conversations. There's still a risk that having those conversations might put you at odds with the guidelines, depending on the precise wording of them. And when I did my PhD, the hospital where I did my data collection had words like women with risk factors will have CTG monitoring.
Oh, okay.
Which meant that the midwife was in a really difficult position, because if the woman chose not to have CTG monitoring, that was the midwife breaking the policy.
Yes.
And so that really discouraged them involving women in decision making. But even if that's the kind of policy structure you've got, I'm pretty sure that at most hospitals, there will also be a policy about informed decision making that says you have to give women a choice, you have to present the evidence, you have to explain the risks and the benefits, and you have to respect women's decision making. So I think you can safely start get across the evidence base yourself, so that you're confident about having those conversations, and start having those conversations. The second thing that drives me really nuts about where we find ourselves is that, because so many people are running around thinking that either we've already found the solution with CTG monitoring, or we're just about to, because we've now got telemetry, we've now got central monitoring, we've now got computer interpretation, we've now got a new WYSI guideline. And if you add them all up and put them in the blender, then it'll work and we'll fix it. What it's doing is it's stopping us from doing research to go and find something radically different that actually will solve the problem for us.
Right.
And so the other place we need to be having those honest conversations is within the professions. Midwives talking to midwives, obstetricians talking to obstetricians, midwives and obstetricians talking to each other and talking to neonatologists, researchers having these conversations, because there's a whole world of possibilities in terms of other ways other than just the heart rate that we might work out whether this fetus is doing okay or not. Because if you sit back and think about it, it's kind of nuts. If you went to an emergency department going, I'm really struggling to breathe and I think my oxygen levels are low, and the only thing somebody did for you was take your pulse and then pat you on the head and say, no, sweetie, you're fine, go home, you would not think that you had good care.
No.
And yet that is essentially all that we do with CTG monitoring. We try and guess oxygen levels on the basis of the heart rate pattern.
Yeah.
We could, and we have previously had technology where you could directly measure oxygen levels.
Yeah.
We could, and we do already have some technology that means we can monitor changes in the electrical activity of the fetal heart that changes when oxygen levels are low.
Yeah.
There's technology that's beginning to be used in adults in ICU where you can measure oxygen levels in the brain directly with a monitor that sits on the head that might be able to be shrunk down in size so that you could put it on the fetal head during labour.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of opportunities, and it bothers me so much that babies continue to die and be damaged because we're still telling ourselves the lie that what we're doing is effective.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We're not pushing things forward, because when I think about other things that have changed in my career, for example, prenatal testing for trisomies, just, yes, you can debate whether that's a good or bad thing, but there have been massive technological developments in that. But in CTG, no. I mean, I work in a unit where we do have STAN, so we do have ST analysis, but it doesn't make a massive difference, I'd say. Although, to be fair, the main difference it makes to me is it gives me the impetus not to intervene. So, for me, I think the main worry with monitoring is it's not just we're not doing any good, we're doing harm by our increase in intervention, whether that's cesarean or assisted vaginal birth or whatever, because we intervene for obstetric or midwifery distress, really, don't we?
Yeah.
But an ST analysis, I think, in my small experience of it, has been valuable in perhaps being able to go, no, that baby's not in trouble.
Yeah. And it's interesting, there's some some fairly good research that's been done and continues to be done. There's another Australian trial just coming out soon, if it hasn't already been published, that when you smush them all together, we're not seeing benefits with the use of ST analysis. It doesn't seem to protect women against the increased caesarean section rate. But the research compares CTG on its own versus CTG with Stan, and I just wonder, like, knowing how obstetricians' brains work, we're all brought up with CTGs, and then Stan came in later. When you're looking at a CTG that is just, making the hair on the back of your neck stand up, you're going to ignore what the Stan says if it says it's reassuring. And I wonder if what we really need, and if anyone's brave enough to do it, is to do a trial where we do CTG versus just the Stan, not CTG plus Stan. Take out the rest of the information and just have the number for the TQRS ratio as the only bit of data that people are basing decisions on, whether that would make a difference or not.
Interesting
people, I mean, as a researcher, it makes sense, but because people are so wedded to the idea that CTGs are the thing that's stopping babiys from dying, it terrifies people when you make a suggestion to stop doing them and use something radically different as a form of monitoring. But we'll never know whether it's a better option unless we do something like that.
Yeah.
And the same when we did have fetal oximetry, when we were directly measuring oxygen levels in labour, it was CTGs versus CTGs plus oximetry. It was never CTGs versus oximetry, which is that's what the trial needs to look like to know whether it's a better technology rather than considering it as an added extra.
No, that's very true. Yeah, you're opening up all sorts of possibilities in my mind. That's great. And I definitely think if you're opening people's minds listening, they need to dip into your blog, because you explore all sorts of interesting papers and topics like this in your blog. And I'm not a very maths analytical person, and so the way you've kind of gone through papers and discussed, well, it could be this, it could be that, and this means this, actually is really helpful for someone like me that is I'm not going to go and trawl through all the data myself. So I really would suggest people dip into that.
So www.birthsmalltalk.com. It's free. It's been running now for 3 years. I post most weeks, so there's over 150 blog posts. Mostly it's about fetal heart rate monitoring. Occasionally I feel the need to rant about something else that's caught my eye. There's a bit of stuff in there about perineal trauma and
the
fetal movement monitoring. And feminism and whatever I feel drawn to write about. I'm in the process of going back to some of the earlier blogs and making them easier for people to understand, because when I started writing it, I thought I was going to be people, obstetricians and midwives would be the people who are reading it, and while they do, there are also a lot of people who aren't trained health professionals who are making use of the blog. So I'm increasingly writing to try and make things easy for that audience as well. Yes, it's a free resource. I have no plans to change it from being a free resource, and I'll keep posting for the foreseeable future. What I've added this year is online courses that are paid, and I currently have one specifically for maternity professionals, and it's a really, really deep dive. Florence has done my mini course, which is 1/10 of what's in the big course, into the evidence, so that no matter who then comes and tries to criticize your knowledge, you will be able to stand firmly on your 2 feet and say, no, I know this in any conversation. There's a similar one that's for birth workers, so that's doulas and childbirth educators and hypnobirthing instructors, all of the people who are working in and around maternity services but are not themselves registered maternity professionals. And there's a course coming next year that's for called Fetal Monitoring the Basics, which will be for birthing women and just anybody who's interested, which will be really easy to understand, shorter and cheaper than the other two options. So keep an eye out for that one. So those ones are paid. I do from time to time open the little free course that Florence has done as a bit of a promotion for one of the other courses. So subscribe and you'll find out when it's available, and I'll let anyone can pop in and do that one, and there's a certificate at the end of it, and it's actual information that's in the professionals course. It's not just me running a 1 hour long sales pitch at you. You get to see literally some of the material that's in the full course and make use of it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it really got me thinking. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And I will put links to your website in the show notes from today. Before we wrap up, I wanted to touch briefly on central monitoring, because we had a little bit of an exchange about that. And I feel a bit torn about central monitoring. So I was always very anti central monitoring because of this idea that, like you say, you could leave the woman in the room and the midwife could be out looking at the fetus, but not seeing the whole picture of what's actually going on in the labour and not being with the woman. Having introduced it in our unit, I don't find that happens, but it does give me an idea of what's going on. So at handover, or we've done the ward round, I've met the woman, I've had a conversation, but then I can look at what's going on, or one aspect of what's going on with her, without going and constantly interrupting. But it does sit in a difficult place for me, because there's that whole no decision about me without me. So tell me, because I think you've got some thoughts about central monitoring.
I do, and this was the PhD. So first of all, what is it? So as we've gotten fancy with CTG technology, we've produced monitoring equipment that means that we can actually gather that data as a digital input. And once it's a digital input, you can move the data somewhere else. So yes, you can see it on a screen that's next to the bed or in the birthing room. But you can also then display it out on, they call it central monitoring because it's usually at a central location within the birthing service. And it's not just one CTG, it's every woman who has CTG monitoring on at that point in time is displayed up on a big screen in this central office. There's also a thing called remote fetal monitoring, which is when, obstetrician can pull up their mobile phone at home and see a CTG trace for a woman that's in a hospital, or one hospital can look at traces at a midwifery practice that's up the road or something along those lines. There has been a randomized control trial that's compared central fetal monitoring with standard CTG monitoring, so we don't have that level of quality research. There's only 3 trials, all of which involved a place where there was already central monitoring and then there wasn't. And so they then looked to see, was there a difference in outcomes between when there was and when there wasn't? And there was no difference in terms of outcomes for the babies. And in 2 of the trials, the caesarean section rate was higher when central monitoring was in use. And we already know that CTG use drives it higher than intermittent auscultation. In one, once they corrected for a change in the induction of labour rate, the difference disappeared. But I think it depends on the context of what else goes on in your unit as to what effect it has. What I found, and this was a hospital that had a very, very strong ethos of the midwife stays in the room with the woman all of the time, and that happened. There was no, even at 2 o'clock in the morning, because I took myself in to do observations at all random hours of the day and night and weekends and public holidays, just to see if I could catch people being naughty. And no, there was no like taking a cup of tea and your biscuits and sitting out at the central monitoring station with your midwife mates at 3 o'clock in the morning and leaving the woman in the room on her own. It just didn't happen. What did happen was a thing that the midwives at this hospital called being K2'd after the name of the particular brand of monitoring equipment they had, which was when the midwife was in the room with the woman who was having CTG monitoring, and there was some change in the CTG pattern that caused alarm for people out at the central monitoring station and had them then come dashing into the birth room. And sometimes it was really disrespectful and disruptive. You know, it was literally slamming doors open and barging in and shoving the midwife out of the way with an elbow and flipping the woman on her side and, you know, pressing emergency buzzers and dashing up corridors to do cesarean sections without really having a discussion about what was going on. That wasn't very common, but it did happen. But even in situations where somebody would walk up the corridor and go have a gentle tap on the door and say, you know, excuse me, can I talk to you about your CTG? People weren't seeing what that looked like from the other side of the door. And what was going on was the midwife had realised that there was a problem with the CTG. She was busy trying to fix the problem with the CTG. She was changing the woman's position. She was checking the woman's blood pressure. She was grabbing a vomit bowl, or you know, the worm might have been in the shower and it might have been interference from hot water hitting the back of the telemetry monitor. So she was actively troubleshooting the situation. And when somebody came to the door, she had to stop. I say she, most midwives are she, some are he's. The midwife had to stop what they were doing to fix the very problem that the people had come to the door to talk to her about, to talk to the people at the door about the problem. So it slowed down the ability to actually respond in a timely way. It also meant that people weren't treating the midwife with respect in terms of recognising that here's somebody who's quite capable of actually logically thinking through, here's an issue, what's the issue, what are the 17 steps that I'm going to try first to see if I can resolve the issue? Now I've reached a point where I actually need external input and I'm going to go get it, because the external input turned up before she got to number 2 or 3 on the list. And so the midwives, it rubbed them up the wrong way and they felt really disrespected, which resulted in some challenges in terms of interprofessional relationships between staff. It kind of sent the message, particularly to newly qualified midwives, that you didn't really need to bother with CTG interpretation because somebody had come and knock on the door and tell you when there was a problem. So it had the potential to de-skill people with CTG interpretation because they just relied on someone who might not even be out there. Because it was not always somebody at the central monitoring station because they were busy, to come and actually say, oh, you need to sort out what's going on. And the midwives spoke about they wanted to protect the birth room to maintain privacy for the woman, which is a really respectful and appropriate thing for a midwife to be doing. And so one of the ways that they could achieve that was that as soon as they recognised that there was a problem with the CTG, they'd get onto the computer and start making that would also appear on the CTG so that the person outside could see, they can see that that's a problem. I can see what they're doing. But the problem was, while they're doing that, they're actually not doing all those things because they can't be in 2 places at once. And so midwives about having to make a decision about, am I with woman or am I with machine? And I can either make her and her baby's safety my first priority, but I risk an invasion of her privacy. Or I can actively try and keep her room private, but then what's happening to safety?
No, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because from my perspective, I feel that it could be good in the room because there's less interruption, but I hadn't thought about what you've just described so eloquently. But the other thing that I feel it does do away with is the awful situation that we used to sometimes be in, where the midwife's worried about the CTG, the midwife calls the midwife in charge or the doctor. Everybody comes in, has a conversation about it. The woman is worried because the midwife was worried. And then the people that come in from the outside go, nothing to see here, it's all totally fine, and walk out again. or worse still, have an argument about it in front of the woman. Whereas those discussions and education and conversation can happen at the monitor outside, and sometimes later on. Doesn't have to be at that moment in time if everything's going okay. So that's very thought-provoking what you just described.
Central monitoring didn't prevent that from happening in where I was doing my data collection for the CTG, though, because what would happen is a woman had been vomiting, the trace had just slipped off the baby. It looked awful, but it was just loss of contact.
Yes.
And because it looked awful, suddenly you've got the obstetric registrar, the resident, the team leader, and another midwife all trooping in at high speed into the room.
Yeah.
Quickly, we need to put a scalp electrode on. And then they'd leave again just as quickly. And the woman would be left going, what's wrong? You know,
what just happened?
These 4 people have just come in and told me that there's something wrong with my baby, and you didn't recognize it.
Yeah.
Like, I can no longer trust you as my midwife.
Yeah.
When in fact there was no problem and it didn't need intervention. You know, if you'd given the midwife 5 minutes to sort out the fact that this woman was vomiting and readjust the CTG, it would have been fine. There was no risk to the well-being of the baby at all. And people still had the disrespectful conversations because they'd barge in and tell the midwife that they didn't know what a baseline was, and you know, so it was still happening. It didn't just shift outside the room. But what happened was that people were then, it became, particularly on night duty, it became a sport to critique CTGs out at the central monitoring station. And the midwives often had, you know, they'd walk out to get a cup of tea and they'd kind of walk into the middle of this game that was being played of people being critical about their practice,
right?
Which they found really disturbing. That there were, you know, conversations about whether they were practicing good midwifery or not that were going on without their consent, their involvement, their awareness and ability to be able to defend themselves. So I think it's really important, particularly for us as obstetricians, because the view that we get is from outside the room looking in, and we tend to only be in when we're invited in, that we can lose sight of the fact that for the person in the room looking out, central fetal monitoring can be a very, very different experience to ours.
That's been very educational and thought-provoking. Thank you. I'm gonna mull that one over and think now about what I do next time I'm on the labour ward with our central monitoring. So I normally end my episode with like a zesty bit, a kind of take-home message. And I'm thinking the zesty bit needs to be being honest with women, unless you think there's something different you want to add.
No, I think that's it's the key. It's, you know, everything that we do in maternity services should be about the women that we're serving, and what we should recognise them as being capable women who ultimately the decision is theirs because the consequences of the decision are theirs. And so, you know, our job as care providers is to make sure we absolutely know the evidence back to front, and we develop really good communication skills so that we can have conversations with people that inform and not terrify, and that open up rather than close down choice for people. And that's that's a really difficult ask. You know, I've spent many years of my career honing communication skills and evidence interpretation skills. So you know, and I think they're much harder to come by than working out how to interpret wiggly lines are.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much for giving up some of your evening to join me.
Thanks for the chance. It's always, you know, mostly I speak with midwifery audiences or with doulas and childbirth educators. So it's an absolute delight to be able to have a bit of a chat with a fellow obstetrician about the issues. And
well, it's my pleasure. And thank you so much. Like, I couldn't believe you were like, yes, I'm going to jump at the chance and And I hope that this episode is everything that people hoped for, but also that it makes people think, stop and think, what are we doing? And have those honest, really good conversations with women. I think that's the perfect place to leave it.
Yes. Bye.
I very much hope you found this episode of the OBS Pod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the OBS Pod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved, on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at the OBS Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Finally, it's very important to me to keep the OBS Pod free and accessible to as many people as possible. But it does cost me a very small amount to keep it going and keep it live on the internet. So if you've enjoyed my episodes and by chance you do have a tiny bit to spare, you can now contribute to keep the podcast going and keep it free via my link to buy me a coffee. Don't feel under any obligation, but if you'd like to contribute, you now can. Thank you for listening.